Hello, I am Yulia, the voice of the podcast Love to Heal. Welcome to a new episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Today, I want to tell you about my recent experience with jury duty. This was not my first experience. The very first time that I served was probably 15 years ago, and that case was super interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. It wasn't a murder case or anything like that. It was a property line dispute. But we actually got to take a field trip there, and it was very memorable to me. Between then and now, I must have been summoned a dozen times. A couple times I went through jury selection but was not chosen. Other times I asked to be excused for various reasons. And finally, I decided I need to get it over with. And the reason I was trying to push it back was because before kids, it was easy. I didn't mind spending a full day at court and then getting paid pennies for that time. But now, as a mom and an entrepreneur who values her time much more, I find it difficult to say yes. But I did. I had to, right? This is my civil duty. But thankfully, this time, as opposed to the very first time, which, if I remember correctly, I was there for jury duty the whole week. This time, it only took one full day to complete. And that's partly thanks to me. I will explain what I mean in just a moment here. First, though, I want to share my thoughts on what I observed in the courtroom. I can't help but mention the presence of God in the courtroom to this day. And hey, to me, seeing tradition alive is amazing. It's wonderful. But I did wonder how other people who don't believe in God, how they feel when they hear someone taking an oath with the phrase, "So help me God," for example. Interestingly enough, I found out later, in my state, in Ohio, and most jurisdictions, you're not legally required to use religious language or swear upon a religious text. Courts, they do allow you to affirm your commitment to truth instead of taking an oath. However, I'm pretty sure that everybody took an oath when I was there for jury duty, when the witnesses came to the stand and then when the jurors were sworn in. So I definitely heard the oath and God's name several times. Then I also started thinking of other places where God is very much part of our life. For example, money. On every U.S. coin and paper bill, it says, "In God we trust." Then there's the Pledge of Allegiance, which is recited in schools and many types of events. So if you think about it, whether you're religious or not, we always have God around us in one way or another. Our country was, after all, founded on a Christian cultural and moral framework, which they borrowed heavily from Judaism, I have to say. Do a little plug-in for Judaism here. But in any case, returning to my jury duty, the case seemed clear-cut at first. This was a young attorney in his 40s, I'm assuming, a father of 2 young children, who was suing a distant relative, not related by blood. He was suing him on 3 counts of harassment: aggravated menacing, stalking by phone, and harassment by other telecommunications. So this guy, the plaintiff, he filed a complaint because his relative wouldn't stop harassing him by texting him these nasty messages. Some of these messages, they referred to a wish, I guess. I don't even want to call it a plan, but like a wish to set the plaintiff's house on fire and then perhaps somehow cause harm to his children and his family in general. So right off the bat, I sided with the plaintiff because the defendant, he never spoke in his own defense. He didn't have to because we needed to prove him guilty. He pleaded not guilty. So he never spoke a word. But also, I tended to side with the plaintiff because the defendant looked very suspicious. And I kept telling myself, you can't be biased, right? And you can't judge a book by its cover, in court especially. But it's so hard not to side with a handsome young attorney who spoke so well and seemed so concerned for his safety, while his relative, supposedly of similar age, who had previous arrests, was overweight, walked with a cane, wore dark glasses indoors, had this long hair and a beard, looked so suspicious. Everything about him looked and sounded suspicious. However, as the case progressed, I and other jurors, as we later discussed this case, we noticed something strange in the behavior of both the prosecutor and the defense attorney. We noticed that there were clear gaps in the evidence that they presented. It's as if they were hiding something from us, and we didn't understand why, and we didn't know what. Nonetheless, like I said, it was difficult for me to get past the defendant's malicious text messages. They were read aloud. Actually, the victim, the plaintiff, he read these aloud. And they were some nasty messages. The defendant, this strange man, he obviously had a lot of anger in him. And he was directing this anger at the victim through these endless text messages. And I mean, endless. There were many, many text messages, and we didn't hear them all. But from what I understand, it was months of text messages every day. And the victim did ask repeatedly to stop, for this guy to stop sending him messages, but he kept going. What was especially interesting to me was that the defendant spoke a lot about God in his texts, but not in the way that I've been learning to talk in my spiritual journey. You know, love, kindness, compassion, forgiveness. No, instead, the defendant, he wrote these text messages with such aggression, so many curse words, and so many threats in the name of God. He went on and on in his text messages about God punishing this young attorney, the victim, about karma coming back to bite him. And then in some instances, it seemed that the defendant was planning to take matters into his own hands, to punish his relative. Nothing actually happened, but that's what it seemed like. It wasn't clear to us at all what issues they might have had in the past. We weren't filled in on this. But regardless, from a spiritual and moral perspective, this defendant, who, by the way, wore a huge cross on his chest, in my opinion, he crossed the line with his harassment. I so wanted to tell that strange man that he was praying to the wrong God. If his God is somehow telling him or influencing him to seek revenge or cause harm to another human being, it's not a true God. That's a false God. That's an idol of some sort. Because the God, our Creator, would never want any human being to harm another. Unless it was in self-defense, like in a war or during, an armed robbery. And if his life were in true danger, yes, that it makes sense for self-defense. But other than that, no, this is wrong. So we spent the morning hearing from the victim and then also from a police officer who had taken the victim's written complaint some months prior. And then we heard the prosecutor and the defense attorney. And the more we heard, the more questions we had. And the case was becoming less and less clear. The jurors, we took a lunch break. We were not to discuss the case during lunch, so I just went off on my own. I read a book. By the way, I read a book called Making It Relevant. I interviewed the author of this book recently on my podcast. If you want to learn more about Torah wisdom and how to make it relevant to today, do check out that book. You can find it on Amazon. And so after lunch, we went into the courtroom just briefly, and we were instructed to go ahead and deliberate. We were escorted into a private room with a big round table and seating all around it. We were given the evidence, the only evidence, which were the printed text messages and 3 papers to sign. Each juror had to sign each of the counts. So we had to come to an agreement and decide if the defendant would be charged on each of the counts. That was all that we were given. The judge asked us to pick a foreman or a foreperson to serve as the leader and official spokesperson for the entire jury. I don't know what got over me, but I volunteered myself and everybody agreed. So I led the jury. Our group was an interesting mix of 8 jurors. There were 3 white people, myself included, the youngest being 20 years old, and the oldest was me at 39. The rest were African American, with the youngest, I think he was around 18, and the oldest around 60. Half were men and half were women. I took the lead, which historically has not been very characteristic of me, but I've noticed so many changes in myself on my spiritual journey that sometimes I think I've become a completely different person. I now see myself as a leader. I'm not afraid to speak in front of audiences. I enjoy things that I used to not enjoy. I mean, just so many things have changed. But it was kind of like a proud moment for me that I took the lead and everybody followed me. So we began to deliberate. Like I said, the only evidence we had were the printed text messages between the victim and the defendant. And even with that, we couldn't do much because there were clear gaps in these text messages. They were not all there. We didn't really know the dates, the timeline. It was very vague. And the more we deliberated, the more I realized that it was not going to be easy to come to an agreement. How could this be? The case seemed so clear. I thought everybody would be on the same page. I thought everybody would say, of course the defendant is guilty. Of course, this is a clear case of harassment. But the more we discussed, the more we disagreed. We had a couple jurors who wanted the defendant charged guilty on all 3 accounts. And then we had a couple that proposed that the defendant was not guilty at all. And ahead of us lay 4 hours of deliberation. 4 hours. At 5 p.m., I told the group, we have to come to some sort of agreement, because if not, we'll be sitting there until next day. Some jurors, they needed to be persuaded one way or the other. Some of us had to give in when, for instance, it was 7 in favor and 1 person against. Of course, they had to give in. Honestly, I could not believe it took us that long to come to a decision. But that was because we didn't have complete evidence. When we asked the judge for some timelines to better understand when the plaintiff actually filed the first complaint to the police, we were denied this information. And then we asked for a couple of other things, and again, we were denied. So the text messages were all we had, but they were hard to follow because most of them looked like gibberish or something that a lunatic would write, with occasional references to some past conflicts between the two parties that we knew nothing about. Due to the lack of testimonial evidence, we had to keep going over what we could remember from the oral statement, which also made me realize if I ever serve on jury duty again, I need to bring paper and a pen to take notes, because you're trying to dig in your memory for what was said, and you don't know if you heard it correctly or if you weren't maybe paying attention at some point during the testimony. And to some extent, the lives of these people are in our hands. They depend on our decision. In the end, we decided that the defendant would be charged on 2 accounts, not 3. But to this day, a month later, this case still haunts me because I don't know if we made the correct decision. And we never found out the sentence, which was also very strange. We thought that typically the judge announces the sentence at the conclusion of the trial. But in our case, the judge said he needed more time to go over the details so he could carry out a just verdict. There were many strange things about this case, but all in all, I enjoyed serving on jury duty again. It was very educational. It was very interesting. The judge had a great sense of humor, and I loved being the foreperson and taking the lead in discussion and handing in the verdict to the judge. But most importantly, I want to finish with my personal takeaways from this experience. And the main thing is for me to continue on my spiritual journey, believing in the one true God, and to continue to follow the Jewish moral compass. What do I mean by that? The Torah is considered the blueprint for life on earth. And being the blueprint, it does a tremendous job at protecting its students from breaking the law. But you see, rather than viewing secular government and religious duties as separate, Jewish law, it's called halacha, it binds them together through several core ethical and legal principles. Let me go over them. First of all, established by the Talmudic sage Shmuel, the principle states that Jews are religiously obligated to obey the civil and criminal laws of the country in which they live. Number 2, the Torah places an exceptionally high moral premium on how religious people conduct themselves in public. Number 3, the Torah recognizes that civil laws, police, and courts are necessary to maintain societal peace. And number 4, many crimes in secular statutory law are already strictly forbidden by the ethical mitzvot, by the commandments of the Torah. So a student that is deeply immersed in Torah study is continuously trained to avoid behavior like verbal deception, fraud, misrepresentation, theft, and legal seizure of property, even placing a stumbling block before the blind, which underpins laws regarding public safety, negligence, and even environmental hazards. By transforming civic obedience into a divine mandate, the Torah acts as a roadmap that naturally steers its adherents away from legal conflicts. And that, my friends, is the beauty of the Torah. Thank you for listening, and stay out of trouble.